Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Well, that was quite something. A 3-day walkout by flight attendants at Air Canada that not many saw coming. Even for people who weren't flying, it was still an unusual drama to watch, with a slew of ups and downs over the course of just a few days. It also left tens of thousands of travelers stranded, and the airline is still working to get things back to normal. The question now is, does any of this set a precedent for other unions in this country? I'm Kris McCusker, and in this episode of The Big Story, we speak to Emma Arkell, a labor journalist at Press Progress. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I know it's been a busy few days.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a very exciting week so far.
Well, and I mean, what do you make of it? I don't even know where to start. There are so many tentacles to this story, and it felt really different. Is that a fair way to assess the situation with Air Canada?
Yeah, I think so. A source that I spoke to earlier this week, a labor expert named Alison Brayley-Ratai, referred to this as a perfect storm, and I think that is a great way to think of this story.
Okay, so walk us through how you saw it. Like all of this, let's go back to last week, and the Canada Labour Relations Board deemed the strike illegal, but the flight attendants did not go back to work.
Yeah, that happened earlier this week. It was at the very end of last week that the flight attendants went on strike, I believe at 12:58 a.m. on Saturday. And then less than 12 hours later, the Minister of Jobs and Families, Patty Hajdu, said that those workers have to get back to work and tried to order binding arbitration. And the union refused to do that. And then, this Monday, I believe, Monday morning, the Canada Industrial Relations Board ruled that the strike was unlawful. And the union once again said, too bad, we're staying on the picket line.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but this is not usually the way it plays out. At least in recent memory, this is not the way labor disputes have played out, correct?
Not necessarily. Over the past year, the government has used the same mechanism, Section 107 of the Canada Labour Code, to force railway workers, longshore workers, and postal workers back to the job amidst their strikes and lockouts. And all of those unions have obeyed that order and gone back to work, though they have challenged Section 107 in the courts. But that's obviously a very long, could be a decade-long process to get answers on whether or not Section 107 is constitutional, is in line with the charter. So it is definitely a turn of events that the flight attendants did not obey the order and stayed on the picket line.
And what did you hear sort of from inside? Like the union news conference earlier this week felt a little hardcore, like the union president saying that he was willing to go to jail over this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that might sound extreme to, people who don't pay super close attention to labor relations, but there is precedent for that in this country. In the late 70s, I believe, the former president of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, Jean-Claude Perrault, did serve 2 months in jail for an illegal strike. So when the head of CUPW National, Mark Hancock, says that he's willing to go to jail over this, there is reason to say that.
And it's interesting as well. I mean, it's sort of, in a way, the way it played out, it kind of was a successful move, was it not? Because they disagreed with this ruling from the Canada Labour Relations Board, opted to not return to work, and somehow forced the airline's hand enough that there were talks, and within, 10 hours or so, a deal.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. It was a good move on the union's part to do that. As I said, Section 107 is very contentious, and a lot of unions are challenging it in the courts. But to challenge it publicly, especially specifically for the flight attendants to challenge it publicly, I think was a great move. They disagreed with being sent into binding arbitration, and they have good reason to disagree with binding arbitration in this case. They want to make some major changes to a very old collective agreement. This is a 10-year collective agreement that they are renegotiating. Those are virtually unheard of. And yeah, staying on the picket line meant that they got to go back to the bargaining table with, I believe, a federal mediary, William Kaplan. And they have a tentative deal that they're going to vote on this week.
Okay, so as far as that goes, are you hearing that it's going to pass the ratification vote? Like, is this the end of the Air Canada labor dispute from where you are sitting as of today?
I can't really say right now. I have seen some of the details. I think it's possible that it will pass. It does begin to address the issue of ground pay, which was a huge issue in this dispute. Ground pay refers to the time when flight attendants are working but are not being paid. So they are essentially only paid when the plane is in the air. All of the pre-boarding work that you watch them do every time you get on a plane is not compensated, and they want to be compensated for that. The tentative deal would give them 50% of their salary as ground pay for an hour before the flight takes off. I guess I'm just reading the details right now. An hour for smaller planes and 70 minutes for larger planes. This isn't really what the union was talking about a few days ago. They were talking about full compensation for all of that work. So I think it's beginning to address some of these issues. It's not everything that I was hearing people wanted on the picket line on Monday. So yeah, it'll be very interesting to see whether or not this passes.
The other thing that I sort of find interesting as an observer in all of this, and you sort of touched on it with this being a 10-year deal that had expired, there was a fair bit of ground to make up as well, just because, to my recollection, again, it feels like there have been some pretty lucrative deals that have been worked out with pilots in years past.
Yeah, that's a great point. Flight attendants were absolutely looking at the deal that pilots got last year. And the pilots did, I believe, have a strike vote. They were, making the matter public, and they were showing their strength. But they ended up getting what was described to me as a very good deal at the end of last year with Air Canada. And so the flight attendants, after 10 years, and just think of everything that's happened in the last 10 years, the way the economy has changed with COVID and the inflation spiral, flight attendants had every reason to believe that they could also get a good deal. And it seems like Air Canada expected the government to step in with 107 and order them back to work if they chose to go on strike. And the flight attendants were also ready for a fight.
The other thing on this Section 107 that you have mentioned a couple of times, the Canada Labour Congress came out and said, this was handled very well by the flight attendants union. And it feels a little bit like Section 107 and the controversy around all of it is not over. Like, I feel like what the flight attendants did in this particular dispute is going to reverberate with other unions.
Absolutely. It'll be interesting to see what happens with 107. Unlike typical back to work legislation, this is not a piece of legislation that the government had to, bring to Parliament and have a debate on. This is just an existing part of the Canada Labour Code that grants the minister quite a lot of power. The wording of 107 itself is quite vague. And so, this is something that the government has seemed happy to use over the past year. This is the first time they've gotten real pushback on it. And the issue is, now one that is top of mind in labor and also like being discussed in the public quite widely, which is great. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any effort on the government's part to curtail that, to, like how do we move forward from this?
Put this into perspective. I mean, you're a labor reporter. Put this into perspective as far as, disputes you have covered. Most interesting, most noteworthy, potentially most consequential.
Well, I was still a freelancer last year when the postal workers went on strike. And so I didn't really get to cover that, but I was paying close attention to it. So this is my first like big national consequential strike as a full-time labor reporter. So that's very exciting. I think this could have huge consequences depending on how the government moves forward with 107. If they try to use it again, does this set a precedent that unions are just simply not going to obey that because they saw that the flight attendants didn't obey, and now they know that they can also disobey it and sort of force bargaining to resume. I think it's interesting, and it has parallels with the education workers strike in Ontario from a couple of years ago. That was another instance in which the government tried to force workers back to the job. They disobeyed. These are both female-dominated industries that have very close relationships with the public, and I think that's what makes these strikes so effective. Obviously, railway workers, longshoremen, and postal workers are essential to the functioning of our economy, but people don't have the same relationship with those workers that they do with education workers and flight attendants, people that you interact with personally, whose work you watch. And so I think that's part of what makes these actions so effective, is that people know these workers, they see them, and they see the work that they do and how hard it is. A flight attendant on the picket line on Monday said that boarding work that they are not paid for currently has increased tenfold. She's been a flight attendant for 30 years and she's seen that work just pile up. One of the reasons is because a lot of people opt for carry-on luggage as opposed to checked luggage. And so this unpaid work has also just like increased so much that now was the time to really fight for paid ground pay. So I think this could also set a new precedent in the industry, that flight attendants need to be paid for that work. It could have huge consequences, and it's really, really exciting to me that a predominantly female workforce is pushing this stuff forward. I love to see that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're right. You make a point about the timing of it all, right? And when this deal was made 10 years ago, we didn't know that COVID was going to come along, and we didn't know there was going to be a trade war with the U.S., and we didn't know that this was going to be a time when they didn't know, I should say, a time when the Canadian economy needed the tourism dollars and needed the national airline to be functioning to help contribute to the economy. Like, none of that was kind of on the radar. So it was almost a perfect opportunity for this union to do what it did because of when it came up. Like, it feels like they sort of capitalized on the moment.
Absolutely. That's why it's a perfect storm. So few unions are renegotiating 10-year agreements. As I said, that is very rare. And that was decided upon and agreed upon back in 2014 when we were really seeking labor stability. It was an environment in which striking was even more contentious. I think the pandemic really changed that, and inflation has really changed that. People recognize that, if we don't fight for better wages, better working conditions, benefits, pensions, like, they will not be given to us. We need to be reminded of that every once in a while. And so, yeah, when you're renegotiating a 10-year agreement, like you probably want some big changes. And a strike is a great way to get those, frankly. That is our biggest hand, you know? That's truly our power, is to withhold our labor. So another thing, as I'm looking at the details of the new agreement, this new one will expire in 2029. So it's a shorter agreement, which I think is also huge, because when I spoke to a worker on Monday at the Vancouver airport picket line, she said that they will never agree to a 10-year agreement ever again.
Yeah, just because, I mean, as we've been discussing, so much can change in 10 years that it doesn't make sense like it used to.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, there's an argument to be made that sometimes the stability is worth it to sign on to a 10-year agreement. But the labor experts that I've spoken to have said that the research shows that it's not really a good deal. You know, that what you get in stability is not worth what you're going to lose in terms of wages, working conditions, working norms.
Fair enough. And I don't know if you can answer this, but I've wondered a couple of times in the last couple of days that, without COVID, would this have played out the same way?
Yeah, it's impossible to say. Yeah, it's impossible to say.
But it does make you wonder, because it feels like there's been a change since the pandemic. Just there have been a lot more strikes since 2020, and I can't help but wonder if the pandemic is, one of the catalysts for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say more strikes. Well, yeah, I would be very interested to look into research on that to see if there have been more strikes. I think there's been a lot of energy behind the labor movement, a lot of really great organizing going on, especially where, provincial legislation is friendlier to organizing. Like here in BC, we have single step certification. The pandemic was a reminder that if you're not going to get anything you don't fight for. A lot of people were forced to put their health and their safety, and in some cases their lives, on the line for their employer. They haven't forgotten that. And the inflation that has happened since the pandemic has left a lot of people behind, and people are ready to fight for what they deserve.
And just for people who don't know, pre-strike, what kind of money did flight attendants at Air Canada make?
Flight attendants' wages are surprisingly low, both because the rate is low. Again, this is a 10-year agreement. This was agreed upon in 2014, 2015. So just think of the way that prices have changed since then. Rent has changed since then. According to CUPW, wages for entry-level flight attendants have only increased by $3 an hour in more than 20 years, which means that those workers are earning just $27,000 a year before taxes. That is below the federal minimum wage.
And we have to remember as well, I mean, this is not just about serving a meal and a few drinks and showing you where your seat is, right? Like the flight attendants do a lot more than that.
Absolutely. When I spoke to flight attendants on the picket line on Monday, they talked about the importance of, helping passengers that need some extra assistance, passengers who are elderly or disabled, or just need a helping hand on the flight. And that work has increased since they last negotiated their collective agreement.
The other thing I wonder, and maybe you can answer this, maybe you can't, and you touched on the postal workers, because now the national focus sort of shifts away from Air Canada as we hopefully get close to an end on that labor dispute, and it shifts back to CUPW and Canada Post. Because there's been a lot of off-on over the last year and a half as far as Canada Post goes. I guess I'm wondering if you're expecting, anticipating, or sort of bracing for a similar drama to play out as those two sides try to reach a deal.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we'll have the drama of what just happened here. I would also say that last year's, I think, 3-week postal worker strike was quite dramatic. And as I said earlier, they were also forced back on the job with Section 107. The latest update from CUPW is that they are back in bargaining with Canada Post. That one is a very difficult dispute because, again, big changes are hoping to be made. When you look at the courier industry as a whole, you can't think about the Canada Post dispute without thinking about Amazon and the way that Amazon operates and all of its third-party companies that serve Amazon. They pay extremely low wages. Their workers work day and night. I'm sure people have seen Amazon delivery people on, Sundays at 9 p.m. still delivering. Sometimes they're using their own vehicles. Like, the deregulation of that industry and the sort of race to the bottom is really informing what's going on with Canada Post. And so I'm very interested to see what comes of bargaining in the coming weeks. Those workers were forced to vote on Canada Post's quote unquote best and final offer. The government forced them to vote on it, and they rejected that best and final offer. So Canada Post is going to have to come with a better deal this time.
And then the other question is, sort of the future of Section 107 and whether or not that goes away.
Yeah, I don't know what the precedent is for, getting rid of a section of the Canada Labor Code. Again, this isn't legislation that was recently passed. It's just in the Canada Labor Code and is quite vague, and so the minister can use it as they see fit. What they do with that going forward, if they promise not to use it in a certain way, I don't know. It'll be very interesting to see how that resolves, because that is still very much an open question.
I feel like as a journalist, you've got one of the more interesting beats in the near term. So
I think it's one of the most interesting beats all the time. I love this.
Okay, fair enough. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today, and a very thorough overview of all the goings on. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's Emma Arkell, a labor journalist at Press Progress. And that wraps up this episode of The Big Story, with more very likely to come on the labor movement in Canada, no doubt. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other by email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can also find us on the Seeker app or all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Kris McCusker. Thanks for listening.